The year is 1908. A search party drifts silently down the flat river, their canoes cutting through black, restless water. The cliffs on either side of them rise like prison walls. Sheer stone 3,000 feet high, leaning in as if to listen. At the front sits Charlie MacLeod. His face is gaunt, his eyes fixed ahead. For 2 years, he has waited for word from his younger brothers, Willie and Frank. They vanished into this valley with promises of gold. Now he comes to find what remains of them. The air is colder here, unnaturally so. Their voices don't carry. Even the river sounds wrong, more hiss than rush. And then they see it, a tent, weather-beaten canvas, half collapsed, almost invisible against the grey stone and thin trees. Charlie feels his chest tighten. He recognizes the shape, the location. It's their camp. The men pull ashore. As their boots hit the gravel, an odor drifts on the wind. Acrid, foul, unmistakable. Death. Outside the tent lies a body, or what's left of one. The clothes are scorched, blackened as if fire had licked across the man's torso. His right arm is stretched toward a rifle in the dirt, frozen in that last desperate reach. His fingers are inches away. But what freezes Charlie's blood is not the posture. It is what is missing. The body has no head. Stumbling forward, choking back horror, the men tear open the tent flap. Inside, tangled in a wool blanket, lies another body. This one is half in, half out of the doorway, as though he had tried to crawl out in the middle of the night. Before something stopped him. He too is headless. Charlie's knees buckle. He knows these men, even in ruin, even faceless. These are his brothers. The authorities will later file their reports. They will write of starvation, of wolves and scavengers. They will call it a tragic end to another reckless expedition. But Charlie sees what the reports will ignore. The carved message on a nearby spruce, left by his brothers. 4 simple words. We have found a fine prospect. Words of triumph, not desperation. And he sees the third set of footprints. Human tracks, pressed deep in the mud, walking away from camp into the endless wilderness. The MacLeod brothers had not died of hunger. They had been hunted, and their deaths were only the beginning. For the next 4 decades, this valley would claim body after body, trappers, hunters, prospectors. Some burned in their cabins, some froze in impossible poses. Some vanished without leaving even bones behind, and more than once, they were found just like Willie and Frank, headless. It would come to be known by a new name, the Valley of Headless Men. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, strange histories, and forgotten legends are worth remembering, if you believe the mysteries of our past should not be lost, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we journey into the Nahanni Valley, a place the Dene people call the land of the head takers. We will trace the string of bizarre deaths and disappearances that plagued this valley for half a century. We will examine the strange clues left behind, the official reports that defied belief, and the whispered legends of a lost tribe that guards the valley's secrets. This is not only the story of missing men, It is the story of a place on the map that seems to hate humanity, a place that resists being known. To understand this North American nightmare, we must first travel back in time, to the ancient warnings that told us never to set foot in this valley in the first place. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. The Nahanni Valley does not welcome visitors. It hides itself in the northern wilderness, buried deep within Canada's Northwest Territories. No roads cut through it. No signposts point the way. To reach it, you must fly or paddle or walk for days through terrain that has broken men far tougher than most. And when you finally arrive, the first thing you notice is not what you see, but what you hear, or rather, what you don't. The silence here is unnatural, not the gentle quiet of a still forest, but a crushing, suffocating absence of sound. Birds fall silent. Even the wind seems muted, swallowed by the immense walls of stone that hem the valley in. Your footsteps echo louder than they should, reminding you that you are small, fragile, and very, very alone. The cliffs rise on either side, 3,000 feet of raw stone that tilt inward like the sides of a colossal tomb. Ribbons of mist cling to their ridges, curling like smoke. And along those walls, caves, hundreds of them. Black mouths staring down like watchful eyes. Some large enough to swallow a house, others barely more than slits. Almost none have ever been explored. Nobody knows how deep they run or what sleeps in their shadows. The Dene people, whose ancestors have lived in this land for millennia, have their answer. They say the caves are the dwelling places of spirits. Some are benign, guardians of the land. Others are predators, older than human memory, waiting to strike down those foolish enough to intrude. They have a name for this place, Naha Dehé, the Valley of the Naha, or, in the whispers of English traders, the land of the head takers. Long before prospectors carried steel pans and rifles into this wilderness, the Dene told stories of a people called the Naha. They were warriors, fierce and relentless, who lived high in the cliffs and descended only to raid. The Naha were said to be giants, or nearly so, taller, broader, moving with the strength of predators. They did not merely kill their enemies, they decapitated them, carrying away the heads as trophies, leaving bodies sprawled like broken dolls. Then, one day, the Naha were gone. No one saw them leave. No one found their bones. The caves that once housed them became empty, or perhaps only seemed so. The Dene said the spirits of the Naha lingered, jealous of their valley, taking vengeance on anyone who dared trespass. To this day, many Dene will not set foot in the Nahanni. Those who do, even briefly, speak of a weight pressing on the air, a sense of being watched by eyes that never blink. From a distance, the Nahanni is breathtaking. Its rivers gleam silver under the northern sun. Spruce forests climb its slopes, and meadows burst into wildflowers in the short summer. Waterfalls plunge in glittering curtains from sheer cliffs. On a postcard, it could be mistaken for paradise, but paradise here is a mask. The rivers are treacherous, swollen with meltwater, studded with hidden boulders that can splinter a canoe in seconds. The weather shifts with no warning. A clear day can become a blizzard before you have time to strike camp. The soil, rich with minerals, resists planting. Even animals seem scarce, as though they, too, avoid the valley's depths. And then there is the silence, always the silence. It gnaws at the mind, feeding unease until every shadow seems alive. Alone in that valley, you do not feel like an explorer. You feel like prey. For centuries, this duality defined the Nahanni, a place of unimaginable beauty, guarded by unimaginable terror. The Dene told their children to stay away. Traders skirted its edges. Trappers avoided its canyons. And yet, word spread. Gold has a gravity all its own. Whispers of hidden riches seeped into the settlements of the north, carried in rumors from men who claimed to have glimpsed nuggets glinting in riverbeds or veins shimmering in cliffs. To those hungry for fortune, the valley's fearsome reputation was not a warning, but an invitation. Because in the north, where thousands of men clawed at dirt and gravel for a few flecks of gold, fear could be a gift. Fear kept other men away, and where other men feared to tread, fortunes might be waiting. The Nahanni became a paradox. To the Dene, it was a cursed land. To prospectors, it was a forbidden treasure chest. Those who braved its depths returned with haunted eyes. They spoke of nights where unseen voices echoed off the cliffs, of shapes moving in the caves above campfires, of sudden chills that froze the marrow. Some claimed to see figures on the ridges, pale, distant, watching. Others insisted they felt hands on their shoulders as they slept, only to wake alone in an empty tent. A few returned with nothing but silence. Men who had entered the valley brash and laughing, and emerged weeks later gaunt, hollow-eyed, unwilling to speak of what they had seen. The valley had a way of stripping people bare, of reducing them not to heroes or adventurers, but to hunted animals. And in time, this atmosphere would not only terrify, but kill. Because in the early 1900s, men began to vanish and the ledger of the lost started to fill. The name would come later. The dread arrived first. Gold had a way of picking its men. It chose the MacLeods. Charlie, the eldest, was steady as bedrock. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that measured every risk, he carried the gravity of responsibility. To friends, he was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Willie, younger by several years, was restless energy. He carried a quick smile, a quicker laugh, and a hunger for more than survival. He wanted victory, fortune, proof that the wilderness could be bent to his will. Frank, the youngest, was sharper, quieter, but just as driven as Willie. He had an edge to him, a need to prove himself not merely equal to his older brothers, but better. Together, they made a formidable team. Charlie was the anchor, Willie the fire, Frank the knife. And in 1904, they heard whispers of a valley untouched, unclaimed, where the rivers glittered with gold. The Nahanni. To Charlie, the story smelled of danger. The Dane's warnings were clear, and he had seen too many men vanish chasing whispers. But Willie and Frank burned with obsession. A forbidden valley meant an untouched fortune, and fortune was worth any risk. Charlie relented. For the sake of blood and loyalty, he agreed to go once. The brothers built their own boat, rough but sturdy, and stocked it with the tools of prospectors, pans, sluice boxes, shovels, rifles, and sacks of flour and beans. In the summer of 1904, they pushed off into the river. The journey was a gauntlet. Rapids tossed their craft like driftwood. Hidden rocks splintered their oars. At times, they dragged the boat by ropes along the bank, half submerged in icy water, cursing the current that seemed determined to kill them. But when they reached the Nahanni, it was as though the wilderness had been waiting for them. They dipped pans into the shallows of a tributary and saw more than flecks, more than dust. They saw nuggets, heavy, solid, gleaming yellow. The riverbed was littered with them. For weeks they worked like men possessed. They filled cans, bags, every container they had. Their boat sagged lower in the water under the weight of their fortune. At night, they dreamed of land, of families freed from hunger, of becoming legends in the north. And then the river turned on them. On the way out, their boat struck hidden rocks. The swollen current seized it and slammed it against stone. In seconds, the craft splintered. Bags of gold sank into the black water, gone forever. The brothers clawed their way onto shore, coughing, freezing, alive, but stripped of everything. Charlie stared into the rapids and felt gratitude. They had nearly died. The valley had shown its teeth, and he wanted no part of it again. But Willie and Frank saw something different. They saw robbery. The Nahanni had stolen their fortune, and they would not forgive it. Charlie walked away. He had no interest in tempting fate twice. He told his brothers they were lucky to be alive, and if they were wise, they'd never return. But wisdom had no place in Willie and Frank's hearts. They dreamed only of the weight of gold in their hands, of the fortune still lying on that riverbed, waiting. To them, the Nahanni was not a warning. It was a debt, one they meant to collect. For 2 years, they saved and prepared. They patched gear, bought supplies, and argued with Charlie until words turned bitter. He refused to join them again. By 1906, they were ready to go without him. They found another partner, Robert Weir, a prospector willing to risk everything for a share of gold. With him, Willie and Frank loaded their boat and pushed off once more into the Forbidden Valley. It was the last time Charlie saw them alive. At first, Charlie told himself silence was good. No word from the valley meant his brothers were working. Maybe they had struck gold again. Maybe they were filling sacks heavier than before. But seasons passed. A brutal northern winter, then another. Spring thaws, long summers, autumn chills, still no word. By 1908, silence had curdled into dread. Charlie knew his brothers. They were reckless, but not fools. If they could have sent word, they would have. Something had gone wrong. He gathered a search party and set out into the valley. The camp emerged from the stone in a drab smear of canvas. The smell reached them first, then the absence, the kind that erases a face. Inside the tent, another body, half tangled in blankets, half sprawled toward the opening, as though trying to crawl out in terror. His head, too, missing. Charlie staggered back, bile in his throat. Even faceless, he knew them. Willie, Frank. The authorities would later call it starvation. Wolves, they said, had scattered the remains. A neat, tidy tragedy. But Charlie saw what they did not. Carved into the bark of a spruce near camp were his brother's last words. "We have found a fine prospect." These were not the words of starving men, and in the mud nearby, footprints, human. A third set, leading away from the camp and vanishing into the wilderness. Robert Weir's body was not there. Charlie returned with grief carved into his bones and questions that would never be answered. Had Weir turned on them, driven mad by greed? Had something else in the valley taken their heads, leaving Weir to flee into legend? The police closed the case with a shrug. The North whispered of betrayal, of ghosts, of the Nahanni's curse. And slowly, a name took root. The Valley of Headless Men, the retellings fixed on one absence. Robert Weir. Weir had been the third man on the expedition. He went in with Willie and Frank. Only 2 bodies came out. That arithmetic was too sharp to ignore. Speculation fed on itself. Perhaps Weir had gone mad under the weight of obsession. Perhaps he had struck them down in a fever of greed. Perhaps the missing heads were not mystery, but method, taken to delay recognition of the corpses, while Weir claimed the prospect as his own. It was a grim tactic, but not unheard of in the lawless frontier. A man's identity was often nothing more than his face. Remove it, and for a while, he was no one. The image took root. Weir as the madman of the mountain, a killer who had abandoned humanity in favor of gold. A shadow wandering the cliffs, rifle in hand, watching from the tree line as prospectors trespassed on his ground. And like all legends, it grew with every telling. In some versions, Weir was no longer quite alive. In others, he was no longer quite human. He became less a man and more a warning. Cross the Nahanni and the madman will take your head. For nearly a decade, that warning held. The valley fell quiet. In 1917, a Swiss prospector named Martin Jorgensen decided to break that silence. He was not a fool rushing into the wilderness with nothing but hope and hearsay. He was trained, experienced, and methodical. A geologist, not a dreamer. To him, the Nahanni was not haunted. It was geology waiting to be mapped, minerals waiting to be measured. Jorgensen dismissed the story of the MacLeods as tragic but human. Willie and Frank had been killed by their partner, he reasoned, and Weir had met his own end in the wild. The mystery was solved. The danger was past. Where others saw curses, Jorgensen saw opportunity. That year, he set up a solid log cabin miles upriver from the MacLeod site. Its walls were thick, its chimney well built. Jorgensen was not a man to cut corners. He planned to survive the winter and work his claim until spring. And by all accounts, he succeeded. His letters home were filled with optimism. He had struck a motherlode, richer even than what the MacLeods had claimed. He urged his partners to meet him the following summer. The valley, he insisted, was safe. His words carried confidence. He wrote not like a man afraid of shadows, but like one who believed he had already beaten them. And then the letters stopped. When his partners made the trek the following summer, they found no jubilant prospector waiting at the rendezvous. Following his trail upriver, they came at last to his cabin site. The cabin was gone. Only a blackened scar remained, charred wood collapsing into itself, smoke still curling faintly into the cold air. And near the ruins lay Jorgensen. His body was burned, his clothes scorched, but his head was missing. The pattern was undeniable. Another prospector, another fire, another missing head. The authorities, when summoned, wasted no time. Their report was clinical, almost dismissive. The stove must have sparked, they wrote. The fire consumed the cabin. Animals carried off the head. Case closed. It was the same rhythm as before. Box ticked. Doubt shelved. But no one in the north believed it. Not after the MacLeods. Not after whispers of Weir. 2 sets of headless corpses in the same valley could not be chance. Jorgensen's death sealed the legend. To trappers, miners, and settlers alike, the Nahanni was no longer merely dangerous. It was cursed. The madman of the mountain was blamed again. In some versions, he had torched the cabin deliberately, erasing Jorgensen's claim and his life in a single act. In others, He was less man than ghost, a revenant whose presence manifested in fire and smoke. The story hardened into folklore. The Nahanni had its phantom killer, and he was human enough to fear, yet supernatural enough to haunt. Months later, another discovery complicated the tale. Downriver, a skeleton was found, weathered bones, scraps of clothing, a belt buckle. Some claimed it belonged to Robert Weir. If true, then the madman of the mountain was not a ghost, not a predator lurking in the cliffs. He was just another casualty of the wilderness, dead and forgotten. But the identification was tenuous at best. In 1917, forensic science was guesswork. A skeleton was identified by boots, by buckles, by memory. There was no certainty, and doubt is fertile soil. For some, the skeleton was proof enough. Weir was dead. The MacLeods had fallen to betrayal. Jorgensen to accident. End of story. But for many others, doubt lingered. If Weir's remains were never conclusively proven, who was to say he wasn't still out there? Even if he had died, what if someone else had taken his place? Another prospector driven mad, another desperate soul turned predator. The Nahanni had become a crucible. Men went in and came out changed, or didn't come out at all. Whether it was Weir or his ghost or something older hiding behind his name, one fact remained. The valley still claimed lives, and the pattern was only beginning. In 1921, an experienced prospector named John O'Brien failed to return from his seasonal trip into the valley. He was no novice. He had survived northern winters before. He knew how to build shelter, ration supplies, and keep his fire alive in the bitter cold. When a small party went in search of him, they found his campsite intact. His supplies were neatly arranged. His rifle was close to hand. The fire pit before him held the pale grey ashes of a long-dead flame, and on a log near the ashes sat John O'Brien. He sat upright on a log, legs bent, unnervingly calm. In one hand, he still clutched a matchbook. A single match was bent, as if he had just struck it to light the fire. But he was dead. Completely, impossibly dead. His expression was what chilled the men who found him. It wasn't twisted in pain or frozen in fear. His face was placid, almost peaceful, as though he had simply drifted into sleep. Yet his body was frozen solid. He had not wasted away from exposure, nor had he huddled in the desperate posture of someone losing the fight against the cold. It looked as if he had been flash frozen in an instant, the life in him extinguished before his mind even registered danger. Searchers struggled to describe it. One said it was as if the air itself had turned to ice in a single heartbeat. Another insisted it looked like O'Brien had been caught between seconds, denied even the chance to know he was dying. The wilderness had many ways to kill a man, but not like this. Not so sudden, not so silent. For the first time, people began to whisper that the valley itself was the murderer, capable of ending a life in ways no human hand, no animal predator could replicate. Just a few years later, in 1926, the valley struck again. This time, not with fire or ice, but with something stranger. A large hunting party had set camp near the flat river. Among them was a young woman named Annie Lafferty. One morning, when the camp stirred awake, Annie was simply gone. Her bedding was undisturbed. Her gear was still neatly stacked by the tent. There were no tracks leading away from the camp. No sign of a struggle. No indication of an animal attack. She had not wandered off in confusion. She had vanished as though lifted out of the world. The party searched frantically. For days, they scoured the shoreline, the woods, even the cliffs. Nothing. Eventually, the search was called off. Annie was mourned, then surrendered to the Nahanni's growing tally of the lost. But months later, a trapper emerged from the wilderness with a story so strange that even seasoned Mounties hesitated to write it down. The trapper claimed that one night, while camping by the river, he was jolted awake by the sound of stones skittering down a nearby cliff. He looked up and froze. In the moonlight, he saw a figure climbing the sheer rock face. It was a woman, naked, pale in the silver light, and she was scaling the near vertical wall on all fours, moving with a speed and fluidity no human should have possessed. The trapper said she paused midway up, her body clinging to the rock like a spider. Then she turned. The face that looked down at him was not human. Her features were contorted, twisted into an expression of animalistic rage. Her mouth was open in a silent snarl, and her eyes, he swore they glowed faintly as though catching light that wasn't there. Horrified, he ducked behind a boulder and did not dare look again until the sounds of stones falling ceased. By dawn, she was gone. When shown a photograph of Annie Lafferty, the trapper turned pale. It was her. He was certain of it. The tale spread quickly. What had happened to Annie? Some claimed she had gone mad, stripped of humanity by isolation, hunger, or some poison in the valley's air. Madness could explain the animal posture, the speed, the feral stare. Others believed she had been possessed, claimed by whatever force haunted the canyon. She hadn't wandered away. She had been taken. Her body was still her own, but her mind had been hollowed out, replaced by something else. It was one thing to believe the Nahanni killed intruders. It was another to believe it could transform them. The idea terrified even seasoned frontiersmen. Death was a risk they understood, but to lose yourself, to be twisted into something unrecognizable, was a fate beyond fear. With O'Brien and Lafferty, the valley's legend changed shape. It was no longer enough to guard yourself against starvation or fire, against betrayal or wolves. Now the land itself seemed armed with weapons no man could anticipate. It could freeze you in an instant. It could strip your mind and leave you crawling on cliffs like an animal. The Nahanni was not merely a place that killed, it was a place that experimented, as if testing new ways to unmake its trespassers. The old warnings about decapitation and fire now seemed almost merciful compared to what it had shown it could do. And with these new horrors, the whispers grew louder. The valley was not just cursed, it was alive. By the early 1930s, the Nahanni was no longer a single tale told around stoves in winter. It had become a ledger. Names, dates, scenes that rhymed with one another too perfectly to be accident. Men still went in, some for gold, some for pride, some because they hated being told where they could not walk, but fewer than before. And when they did, they left word with friends. If I don't come back by spring, go to the river first. Phil Powers kept his own counsel. He wasn't the sort to brag in a saloon or to spook easily at stories. He built deliberate lives in deliberate places. A trapline set like a clock, a stovepipe joined tight, a roof that shed snow instead of swallowing it. When he chose a site in the valley, those who knew him assumed the same habits would keep him safe. They didn't. When smoke was seen where it shouldn't be, a pair of men cut across country to find his cabin slumped into itself. Timbers turned to charcoal, the ground beneath still warm enough to soften boot soles. Powers lay inside the ruin. What was left of him told a different timeline than the ash around him. His limbs were too still, his posture too neat. Whatever had ended him had done so before the first ember leapt. The conclusion among those who stood there, hats in hand, was not a puzzle, but a sentence. The fire was cover, not cause. Someone, or something, had arranged an ending and then burned the page. They took what remained and left a ring of footprints in soot. The wind erased those by morning. No one returned to rebuild on the same site. Even the stubborn have their limits. With powers added to the tally, men began to speak in a new way about the valley. Not in metaphors, but in numbers. First the brothers, then the Swiss, now a trapper who did everything right. It was as if the place were taking samples, testing a man who trusted fire, a man who trusted planning, a man who trusted strength. The methods changed. The result didn't. 5 years later, 2 partners, William Eppler and Joseph Mulholland, worked a claim deeper in the corridor than most dared. They weren't reckless. They were persistent. They built a small cabin against a rise, stacked green wood to season, cached extra flour in a crate high on poles where animals couldn't nose it. Their letters out were sparse and practical. Working, wind high, luck improving. When the summer rendezvous passed without them, a search party followed their line upriver and found the cabin's outline in charcoal, a wind-blown rectangle of black, like a door drawn on the ground. Inside that line, nothing. No bones under the ash, no iron buttons fused to char, no buckles, no belt tongues, no knife tangs, no rifle barrel warped by heat. The crate on poles had collapsed and lay empty, but the earth beneath the crossbeams was unmarked, as if no one had stood there for months. The men who came to look stood longer than they meant to, scanning for some scrap that would satisfy the rules they knew. Fire consumes flesh, not iron. Men should leave more than rumors. But the valley had presented a stage set scrubbed to blankness. The more they searched, the more the blankness felt intentional. They widened circles into the brush. They found a torn glove in a snag of willow 20 yards away. It belonged to neither partner. They found a fox track wind-etched into flour dust where the crate had fallen. Nothing else. The official word back in town was uncommitted, missing, presumed dead. Among the men who had kicked through cinders, a different phrase circulated: taken clean. A decade's worth of stories can harden into something permanent or erode to rumor depending on what comes next. In 1945, the valley chose to sharpen the original edge. Ernest Savard ran his seasons like railway schedules. He fixed traps on precise intervals, mended lines when they frayed, and slept with his bedroll tight against the ground, so cold couldn't crawl underneath. He was found not far from the river, zipped into his bag as if the night had been ordinary. There was no smell of smoke, no stove kicked over, no struggle scuffed into the dirt. There was only the simple brutality of absence. His head was gone. No new twist, no theatrical flourish. Just the same mark that had turned whispers into a warning 40 years earlier. Older men who'd been young when the MacLeod story broke said the valley was speaking plainly again. I haven't forgotten how to do this. By then, trappers and prospectors kept their own private ledgers, names on one side, what was done to them on the other. You could watch the columns widen, fire that didn't begin with life, disappearances that removed even the metal a man wore, clean decapitations that seemed almost surgical in their clarity. Each method contradicted the last, until contradiction itself felt like the rule. Patterns emerged inside the pattern. Burnings tended to happen at structures. A cabin reduced to an accusation. The vanishings clustered around camps that had just begun to produce. The beheadings cut close to water, as if the current had been promised a share. Men planned against each new lesson. Some stopped using stoves and cooked outside. Some slept with their boots on and a rifle sling threaded through one arm. Some refused to camp within sight of standing timber that could hide a watcher. It didn't seem to matter. The valley adjusted with them. What rattled the north most wasn't the body count. The frontier is casual with numbers. It was the sense, spoken in quiet corners by men who didn't believe in much, that something was learning. Not one hand repeating a signature, but a series of hands, or a will behind them, practicing. The way an animal tests a fence for weak points at different hours. The way a storm finds the one seam in a roof you didn't think to check. By autumn of 45, merchants in river towns kept a bottle behind the counter for anyone coming in off the Nahanni. Not for celebration, there was nothing to toast, but because men came out of there with a stare that didn't crack on the first try. Outfitters began asking new clients where they intended to travel. If the answer was the valley by name, the price quietly doubled, or the gear was suddenly spoken for. Guides who once would have shoved a map across a table now shook their heads and suggested other rivers whose dangers stayed in the realm of weather and wolves. Letters home from those who tried anyway grew shorter. The bravado drained from them, replaced by a transactional brevity. 2 weeks in, gravel bar good, weather turning, back by August. Some of those letters arrived after the men didn't. The stories became a kind of contagion. A burned cabin in one camp would lead the next camp downriver to pack in daylight, to lash their gear too tight, to make poor time and worse choices. Fear picked up its own momentum. Men snapped at small sounds, argued over routes, turned back because their hands wouldn't stop shaking at dawn. The valley didn't have to kill every person who entered. It only had to unmake the groups that survived by trust. Even those who laughed at talk of curses adjusted their speech. They no longer said if when they spoke about danger in the Nahanni. They said when the wind comes wrong, when the stove backdrafts without warning, when you feel a prickle at the base of your neck and realize you've stopped hearing the person who was just behind you. By year's end, there were 3 tiers of talk. The first belonged to officials who wrote tidy paragraphs that fit neatly in ledgers. The second belonged to families who wanted bodies and got silence. The third belonged to the men who went in and came out with something missing you couldn't point to. They spoke softly and too precisely, and if you pressed them for color, they said only, "It's not like other country. It has its own ways." What happens in a territory when a place becomes a rumor you can't bury? Shopkeepers start knowing the names of the lost before the telegrams arrive. Children learn not to ask where uncle went. The church bell that used to toll for births and weddings spends more time doing other work. By the winter after Savard, the Nahanni had become more than a location on a map. It was a presence that altered behaviour far beyond its cliffs. The Mounties heard the change in the way their own constables spoke after taking statements. Fewer jokes, more precise notes. Supply clerks began to mark crates for valley-bound parties with a pencil cross, as if admitting superstition cost nothing and might buy something. When a seasoned miner named John Patterson failed to return from a solo trip, the reaction wasn't a shrug and a form to be filed. It was a stiffening. People who had ignored the valley's history suddenly had a name to attach to the feeling in their stomach. The ledger had one more line than the town could bear. The patience for tidy paragraphs thinned. Men who'd never met Patterson took it personally. The country had a limit, and the valley had found it. By 1945's last thaw, the legend had outgrown firesides and bar tops. It had become an epidemic in the way a drought is an epidemic. Slow, relentless, affecting those who've never seen the cloudless sky that caused it. Prospectors in other districts use the valley as a measure for their own luck. At least, it's not the Nahanni. Outfitters began keeping spare kits in case men came out of the canyons barefoot or bare-eyed. A few did. The arithmetic had turned public. You could read it in the small notices tacked to post office boards, seeking news of W. Eppler and J. Mulholland. Last seen. Reward for information regarding E. Savard. You could hear it in the pauses between sentences when old hands described the year's routes. A hesitancy that wasn't there before. A place can become a story. A story can become a rule. By the time winter locked the rivers again, the Nahanni's rule felt simple. It would take someone soon, and not quietly. The North waited, teeth clenched against a wind they couldn't feel yet, for the next line in the ledger. When it came, the response would not be a pair of men with a canoe and a bottle. It would be uniforms and discipline and the belief that order could be imposed on a place that had no interest in being ordered. But that is the next chapter. This one ends with a count. A trapper, dead before the first spark, two partners erased down to nails and knives that should have remained. A man in his sleeping bag returned to the oldest signature. The valley's portfolio had grown. The legend had multiplied. And what had begun as a warning told over one counter had become the North's open wound. By spring of 1946, one name sharpened all the unease into a single point: John Patterson. He was experienced, methodical, and overdue. The telegraph chatter that followed wasn't the usual shrug that accompanies men who choose hard country. It was clipped, urgent. This time, the response carried crests. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police organized a proper operation, not the piecemeal searches of years past. Permits were issued, manifests checked. They selected constables who'd wintered on traplines, men who could fix a stove elbow in sleet and read a week of weather in the tilt of smoke. Alongside them, the best local hands were hired, guides who knew which gravel bars were honest and which pretended to be. They staged from a settlement upriver. Gear was weighed, redistributed, weighed again. Rifles wrapped in oiled cloth. Maps smudged where fingers always land first. The plan was simple on paper. Push to Patterson's intended area, work outward in a spiral, leave cairns with notes as they went. Find a camp, a trail, a sign. The first days were business. The motor canoe coughed and settled into a steady thrum. Poles bit gravel when the water thinned. Along the banks, stands of spruce moved past like a procession. The men spoke in low voices, only to compare bearings and mark points. If anyone carried the valley's stories, they kept them zipped behind their teeth. They made good time until the river narrowed and shouldered them toward the stone. They found a bar of cobble just big enough to serve as a base, high enough to shed a surge, low enough to be near water. Camp went up by habit, tent lines taut, a trench for runoff, stove assembled with practiced hands. A single lantern hung from a crosspole. They logged the day's coordinates and sat to a supper that tasted like all suppers taste after long effort, better than it should. An hour after dark, the first unexpected thing happened. Figures appeared at the edge where the lantern light went blind. No brush crackle announced them, no throat clearing, no hail. They were Dene hunters, 3, then a 4th behind them, standing as if grown from the shadow. The constables rose half a hand toward their rifles, not in threat, but instinct. Then they let them fall. The visitors' faces were unreadable, the kind of stillness that looks like stone from 10 paces. One of the Dene stepped forward enough that the light caught the edge of his cap. He spoke quietly in English, worn smooth by use, the way you speak on winter trails where words cost heat. "You should not be here tonight," he said. "There are white figures in the woods, near the river." He let the sentence sit between them. No elaboration, no story to soften the edges. The officers asked careful questions. How many? Where seen? What time? The man answered with a small tilt of his head toward the trees, toward up valley, toward now. Then, as if some interval had closed, the group folded back into the dark with the same soundlessness with which they'd arrived. No one pretended the warning hadn't landed. The men checked their perimeters, counted ammunition they knew was already counted, moved the lantern higher. The night pressed close. The flame drew moths and every other eye that fire draws. The second unexpected thing was sound. It began as a single, long note that the men argued later about. Some swore it started low. Others said it came in like a shriek heard from far off. However it entered, it held. Not wind exactly. Wind has character and a kind of honesty. This was a held voice with no throat to point at, stretching over the tent canvas until it tingled their skin. A second call answered from somewhere beyond the river, higher and serrated, a tone that made the muscles along the scalp want to crawl. Then a third farther left, then 2 together, overlapping like saw teeth, and the night filled with a lattice of sound that made distance meaningless. It was impossible to tell which direction mattered. Every direction mattered. The men did what trained men do when something refuses sense. They sat shoulder to shoulder, backs against kit boxes and poles, rifles across their knees, and counted breaths. The lantern's flame shrank and lifted with drafts they couldn't feel. Someone whispered a number, 1, 2, 3, trying to impose a beat. The sound ignored it. They worked through reasons. Wolves? Anyone who'd slept by a winter river knew a wolf chorus. This was not that. People. Human voices break, carry language even when they cry. This carried shape without words, grief without mouth. The senior constable, a man who had once written tickets to captains and escorted a murderer without blink, licked his lower lip and found it dry as salt. Time misbehaved. Minutes felt like a string someone kept pulling back through the same loop. One of the guides rose to stoke the stove and sat again without remembering the space between. The chorus climbed, fell away, returned stronger, like a tide that had learned new math. At some point after midnight, No watch agreed with another by then. The sound came very close. Not louder, closer. It hung just beyond the ring of the lantern's reach, in the trees that looked blacker for being near. One of the younger constables lifted his rifle to his shoulder and kept it there for a count of 100. The older man beside him put a palm against the barrel and eased it down without looking at him. They listened to the dark breathe. There were no footfalls, no brush stirred, no splash on river stone. That absence gnawed as much as the sound itself. The warning had been of figures. Whatever owned these voices did not need to step. The chorus changed character toward what they guessed was dawn. It thinned, not in volume but in number, like a crowd dispersing through alleys. The last of it lifted and seemed to take something with it, the way a train does when it pulls away and leaves a silence that wasn't there before. The eastern sky bled a color that looked like mercy. Men stretched spines, gone rigid, and felt shame for having hoped so hard for a sun they knew would be cold anyway. The senior constable stood, said they would break camp, and nobody argued. They didn't say retreat. They didn't have to. You retreat from an enemy. This felt like leaving a place that had spoken. They policed the site by reflex, as if tidiness would please whatever judged them. Ashes were drowned, latrine filled, a small cairn built with a note inside. Date, names, a line that read, audible phenomena all night, no visible source. The handwriting that usually leaned right sat upright and careful, letters evenly spaced the way you do when your hands want to shake. On the water again, they kept the boats tight as schoolchildren crossing a street. No one sang. When men spoke, they did it on purpose and only about depth or speed. By noon, the silhouettes of the high walls had softened into something that looked like any other hard river, and the first jokes came, brittle as new ice. Even brittle jokes have a job. Back at the detachment, the report landed on a desk that had seen less reasonable paperwork. It did not talk about curses. It did not mention the warning except in factual terms. 4 Dene men. Statement regarding white figures. It listed bearings, barometric pressure, times to the minute until midnight, and then estimates after. Audible events appeared 4 times. No contact appeared twice. The word fear did not appear at all. You could feel it in the white space. They had not found Patterson. They had not found a camp or a scrap or even a plausible wrong turn. They had found a night when the world refused to be the way it was yesterday. The men were not the same either. The younger constable who had raised his rifle started cleaning it each evening, as if something might have gotten on it you couldn't see. The guide who could sleep on spruce boughs anywhere in the north now found he needed to hear a stove tick as it cooled before he could close his eyes. The senior constable wrote his wife an ordinary letter about groceries and weather, and ended it with an extra, "Be well." He could not explain. Word traveled faster than the paper did. Not the details. Those stayed mostly between men who had been there. But the outcome. The uniforms had gone in with maps and discipline and come out with nothing you could hold up to a lantern and say, this is what it was. Whatever lived in that corridor, whether animal, human, or other, did not care about crests on buttons. Dawn had saved them from a night that seemed to have no end. It had not given them a path forward. The ledger got one more line. Search terminated. No result. The Valley, for its part, did not bother to write anything down. It had spoken in a language the men understood with their bones. That was enough. By the late 1940s, The Nahanni had accumulated too many bodies and too many stories to ignore. Something had to be responsible. But what? The simplest explanation pointed to people. Robert Weir's ghost still walked through conversations, some swearing he never died, that he lived on as a feral outlaw, claiming any trespasser as his next victim. Others pushed the story further. The MacLeods hadn't stumbled on gold. They had crossed into the hunting ground of a hidden people. The Dene had always whispered of the Naha, a fierce tribe that vanished into the canyons centuries earlier. To believers, they hadn't vanished at all. They had hidden, guarding their valley with the only warning they thought intruders would heed, the taking of heads. But for those unwilling to blame men, there was the beast theory. The Dene spoke of the Waheela, a white-furred predator, larger than any wolf, older than any myth, haunting the frozen north. The decapitations, the tracks that appeared and disappeared, the chorus of screams, all could be explained by something neither animal nor legend alone, but a blend of both. The Waheela was said to be a survivor from another age, patient, clever, and merciless. Then, there was the unsettling idea that the killer was not a man or a beast at all, but the valley itself. That the Nahanni was not geography, it was intent. A will that shifted its methods to keep people guessing. Fire, ice, silence, madness. If the cliffs could be a mouth, if the wind could be a voice, then the headless bodies were not messages from a killer. They were messages from the land, written in blood and ash. In the late 20th century, scientists armed with instruments tried to peel away the superstition. They found that the caves and canyons could act like organ pipes. Wind funneled through stone produced howls that mimicked voices. They measured infrasound, vibrations too low for ears but strong enough to twist perception, causing dread, panic, even cardiac arrest. They noted the scavenging habits of wolverines, who often removed heads to cache for later. And they pointed to the slapdash cabins themselves. Green logs, makeshift stovepipes. One stray spark could turn a winter refuge into a funeral pyre. Answers with straight edges. And yet, one discovery broke the neatness. Cave explorers in the late 20th century uncovered signs of recent human habitation, not relics from a vanished tribe, but fire pits, tools, and bones dated to just a century earlier, the very era when prospectors vanished. It suggested a possibility no one wanted to say aloud, that the Nahanni's horrors might not have been ghosts or beasts at all, but people. A hidden clan, surviving in secrecy, using the valley's natural terrors, its shrieking winds, its paralyzing silence, as weapons, killing to defend their refuge, and letting legend do the rest. Theories piled like cairns, a mad killer, an ancient beast, a living land, or a desperate clan hiding in its shadows. None explain everything, all explain too much. And so the valley keeps its secret. For 40 years, the Nahanni Valley took men in and sent them back out as stories. Some returned headless, some burned, some vanished without a trace. Others never came back at all. Step back from the ledger of names, and the question becomes larger than prospectors or trappers. What does this story tell us about ourselves? At its heart, the Nahanni is a mirror. It shows us what greed can do, how the promise of gold can draw men past the warnings of their families, past the counsel of their neighbors, past even their own instinct for survival. It shows us the reach of fear, how quickly people will trade reason for rumor, how entire regions can shape their behavior around the shadow of a place. And above all, it reminds us of the wilderness itself, how it resists our attempts to measure and master it. We like to think the map has conquered mystery. The Nahanni whispers that we are wrong, and so we are left with three explanations. The first, the human ghost, a mad killer, or perhaps an isolated clan hidden in caves, protecting their home with violence and secrecy. If this is true, then the valley is not cursed. It is simply human nature at its most desperate, and that may be the most terrifying thought of all. The second, the beast in the dark, a predator older than our memory, a Waheela stalking the riverbanks, a force of flesh and tooth that reminds us how little of the natural world we truly know. If this is true, then the valley is not a mystery. It is a relic, a piece of prehistory that never left. The third, the land itself, the cliffs and canyons, the shrieking winds, the invisible vibrations in the air, all combining into something greater, something alive, a place that chooses how you die. If this is true, then the Nahanni is not just geography. It has a will, and we are unwelcome. Science explains the pieces. Wind that howls like voices, infrasound that panics or stops a heart, wolverines that take heads, stoves that become pyres. But the problem with neat explanations is that they stack too perfectly, one on top of the other, all in the same valley, all in the same 4 decades. Too many accidents to be coincidence. Too many answers for there ever to be just one. That is the unsettling truth. The Nahanni refuses to be solved. Every theory explains something, and none explains everything. And perhaps that's the final lesson. Some mysteries are not puzzles to be cracked, but warnings to be heeded. Because if a place like the Nahanni exists, how many other valleys are still waiting to be found? If you believe these stories matter, if you believe the shadows of our past should not be forgotten, you can help us keep this archive alive. Like this video, share it with those who walk too confidently into the dark, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the unknown. This has been the Midnight Archives. Until next time, keep your lantern lit.